Thanks very much for that. I am going to do about 20 minutes of Q&A.
Yeah. Your Aisha Hazarika for
I'm
these
Aisha.
purposes.
Yes, Aisha is unfortunately ill, my podcast co-star.
Do you think it's a diplomatic illness? Aisha used to work for me, so I wonder if it was a sort of PTSD situation.
No, I think it's because she insists on going Good Morning Britain at 4:30 in the morning.
Yeah, well, that might
driven her
be
to sickness.
Yeah, that might be true actually.
But anyway, so unfortunately, you have me instead for 20 minutes.
She would be doing impressions of me, by the way, if she. So no pressure, Sam, but you might have to do an impression of me.
I'm definitely not going to pretend that. We've not met before, so I'm not going to start doing impressions of you straight off the bat.
That's a relief, anyway.
I am going to have a little bit of time at the end for audience questions, so please think of very succinct one-sentence questions that you might want to ask, and we'll take a few of those at the end of this bit. I wanted to start by asking about where you ended, essentially, your sort of differences with the current government. It feels like a lot of British politics at the moment is sort of almost like a dance of the dividing lines. As sort of Conservatives try and set a dividing line on tax and spend or immigration or culture wars, and you guys say, no, we're not going to engage with that one, we don't want to have that fight. This fight, when Rishi Sunak sort of tried to create this dividing line in his speech a few months ago, you've sort of gone, yes, we'll have that one, we want to have this fight. This is a fight where we actually think we're on the right side of this dividing line, not just in terms of the policy, but in terms of the politics. What makes you think that sort of public opinion is with you on this one and not where sort of Sunak is and sort of saying, actually, yes, we want to do something about this, but people don't want to pay upfront from their pocket at a difficult time for it?
I mean, look, I'd say three things just briefly in response. I mean, look, first of all, you've got to do the right thing. I don't want to sound sort of too unfashionable, but I mean, how can you look at the climate crisis and say, oh, well, the answer is let's delay? We are heading to sort of hell in a handbasket, according to the UN and everyone else. We are, I think it's something like 80 days this year have been over 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. 1.5 degrees is the thing we're trying to sort of stop. So, look, you start with the sort of the facts on the ground, if you like, and that's the first thing. Secondly, I think just to sort of pick you up just on this question, I think if we'd been having this conversation 10 years ago, a bit more when I was Energy Secretary, we might have said, well, green is more expensive in the short run, but it's the right thing to do in the long run. That was the sort of Stern report of the 2000s, which said that the long-term costs of action are less than the long-term costs of inaction. But what was true in the long run is now true in the short run too, at least in some areas. If you take my area, the area I talked about, our clean power mission, renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. They're not just more secure, but they are cheaper. Last summer, they were 9 times cheaper. They're still significantly cheaper, even with the rise in offshore wind. This isn't a climate versus cost of living choice. This is tackle the climate crisis and the cost of living choice. Insulating homes the same goes for that. So I think the way I often talk about this is I say this is about lower bills, energy security, more jobs, and climate leadership, because you need to do all of those things. So. And I think that, and lastly, sorry, it's a long answer, but just on the public, I think the best work actually has been done by Luke Trill from More in Common on this. It's just not true that there is a sort of culture war waiting to happen among the British public on climate. Whether you're a red wall voter, a Tory voter, Brexit voter, okay, it's different priorities for people, but people get this as a problem. People in my constituency get this as a problem. And in a way, I think it's sort of a bit insulting of Rishi Sunak to say, well, I can sort of try and create a culture war over climate. That's not what my constituents want.
I mean, I agree with you. I think they've misjudged public opinion, but there are going to come points, and we saw it with you, Leslie, that's not about climate change, that's about air pollution, where there is a trade-off to be made between something that will affect the public and your agenda. I mean, if you look at your 2030 goal around electricity net zero, it's very hard to see how you can upgrade the grid without some additional cost to energy bills. So how are you going to manage those trade-offs when you get to them?
Okay, that's a good question. So, look, first of all, just on the grid, there is a cost to building the new grid, and that's sort of National Grid has set that out, and the government notionally wants to get there. But any costs of building a new grid is massively outweighed by the reductions in costs from having the renewables on the system. I mean, these delays of 12 years are literally driving up bills. Just to give you one quite sort of, just one simple fact, the onshore wind ban in England has cost every family in the country £180 on their bills, is costing £180 on their bills annually. If we'd had all that onshore wind, bills would have been £180 lower. Now, then on your point about where there are upfront costs, so for example, the transition to heat pumps, for example. So this is why I think conservatism has a problem in addressing this, because the obvious answer is you've got to collectivize the costs in some way. Our insulation plan, helping people with heat pumps, which to be fair, the government's done in a very modest way. If you say to people, you're going to have to bear these costs alone, people aren't going to come with us, But if you say, look, we recognize that in some areas, and by the way, home heating is the sort of, home heating and homes, I think is the biggest single area of cost. Look, we think there is a role for public investment because this is a way to make the transition fair, and it is in our economic interests as a country to do it, then I think you can take people with you.
Well, but within that, there's another trade-off, isn't there? Because the reason we haven't had wind farms being built in England is because people don't like things being built near their houses. We have this big problem with planning in this country now. Obviously, Keir Starmer has talked, Rachel Reeves has talked about taking on the planning system. Lots of politicians have said that and then found it was very difficult to do. When you've got every morning in the papers stories about people saying we don't want pylons next to us, we don't want wind turbines next to us, how are you going to push through the planning change necessary?
Okay, so good question. I mean, on onshore wind, the polling figures are fascinating because, I don't know who. I mean, the government DESNZ produces their own opinion polls, and by 20-1 people support onshore wind. And even when you live near onshore wind, because they asked this question, there is majority support for it. It's just not the case that people. Of course, there are some people in a community who oppose onshore wind. The problem is that the government introduced a planning rule in England which said if one person objects, literally one person, then it can't go ahead. Well, developers have just given up on onshore wind in England. Look, on the grid, the pylons, this is a big challenge. This is definitely a big challenge for the coming years, whoever is in government. My sort of answer to this is, one, you've got to make sure there is proper community benefit. It should be compulsory, not optional. So communities and people who have pylons near them need to get benefit from it. Secondly, obviously we need to hear people's voices and people need to be consulted with. But thirdly, we are going to have to build. I mean, if we don't build, then we're going to remain, it's often underestimated. We only imported 5% of our gas from Russia at the beginning of the crisis when Russia invaded Ukraine, but we were the worst hit country in Western Europe. Well, how does that figure? Well, because we're so dependent on fossil fuels, and whether fossil fuels come from the North Sea or imported from abroad, we pay the same price for them. And so that's the choice, really. We can carry on being, and the OBR has been brilliant on this, the OBR and the Infrastructure Commission in their reports. We can either carry on being exposed in that way, leaving aside climate change, or we can have a more secure way forward.
Let's get on to this sort of catalytic investment that you talked about in your speech. You mentioned right at the end the sort of vexed 28 billion, the sort of Schrodinger's 28 billion that exists or doesn't exist depending on which newspaper briefing you read. It sounded from what you were saying it does exist, which is good.
Of course.
But also it would be good to hear a little bit about what you actually want to spend it on rather than just the sort of figure itself.
So what we've said so far, and we've been deliberately cautious in our commitments because, clearly we're working on our plans, and we said it's going to ramp up to 28 billion a year in the second half of the Parliament, of the coming Parliament, if there's a Labour government. So what we said so far is 8 billion on our National Wealth Fund. That's 8 billion, sorry, not a year, 8 billion over the period. And that's for things like the port infrastructure, which is a big deal because it is kind of underestimated in public debate in this there is huge anger in communities because they see these enormous, particularly true in Scotland, but elsewhere, they see these enormous offshore wind farms going up, and none of the manufacturing is done in that community. This is just off the coast. Now, why is that? Partly because our ports haven't been fit for purpose, partly because there haven't been proper incentives. So we've said there'll be this £2.5 billion British jobs bonus, £500 million a year to incentivize companies to invest. Things like the steel that I talked about, the partnership with the steel industry, electric vehicles. So that's the National Wealth Fund with the British jobs bonus on top. Secondly, we've said that we will ramp up to 6 billion a year of the 28 in insulation and home energy. And that's because when you look at we look at the lowest heat pump take-up in the whole of Europe, I think. If you look at that challenge, to make it affordable for people, you've got to both have, you've got to both insulate homes, but otherwise, the heat pumps won't be as effective, certainly in the case of some homes, and you've got to make them affordable for people. Now, hopefully the costs will come down over time, but I think the National Infrastructure Commission said we need to spend about $2 billion a year on subsidising the cost of heat pumps, and obviously we haven't committed to that figure, but that's a sort of important thing in our thinking. So they're the main commitments we've made. In addition, we've said, and this is something that happens in Germany and Denmark a lot, and I think we could do a lot more here on this. We've said that GB Energy, over the course of a parliament, will spend about invest about 3 billion through a combination of grants and loans in community energy, because this is a way to get communities to feel a real benefit from this renewable power revolution. And I think this is a way actually of doing genuine levelling up. The largest onshore wind turbine in England is in the Lawrence Western estate in Bristol. It's owned not by a private company, but by the local community, which has, this is community wealth building, but through renewables, which has the money flowing back to it. So that gives you a flavour of what we've committed to. But then as we set out our plans, this is a whole economy transformation we're talking about. So everything from nature to transport to public buildings, things like schools. So all of that, at least are candidates to be part of this change that we're talking about. And this is necessary to get the economic change I talked about, to meet our decarbonisation goals, and to get energy bills down.
So, I think what you've sort of committed to there sounds like about 6 or 7 billion a year towards the end of the Parliament. Are you not worried? You used to work in the Treasury. Are you not worried the Treasury are going to say, OK, we'll have the rest of that, please, to manage our spending review figures, given how tight...
No, because we're going to set out, by the time of the election, how we're going to ramp up to 28 billion a year. And honestly, I read some of the reports about this with bemusement. Rachel and Keir and I have worked on this plan together over 2 and a bit years now. It was first announced by Rachel at the party conference in October 2021. It is an absolutely crucial part of our growth story. I think Nick Stern is brilliant on this. Lord Stern, he always says this is the growth story of the 21st century. And so, for us, this is an absolutely crucial part of it. And I genuinely believe that if we are in government, we will have in Keir and Rachel people who are, with no disrespect to the previous Labour government, and my former boss Gordon, we'll have the most committed Prime Minister and Chancellor that we've had on this agenda.
I guess the reason I think people get a bit confused about it is there's this tension between what you're saying in terms of all this investment you want to do for growth and this sort of ironclad fiscal rule rhetoric. And we don't know what's going to happen to the public finances over the next couple of years. They're not in a great place at the moment after sort of the last 13 years. So there's got to be a chance that we'll be in such a difficult position on the public finances that to meet the fiscal rules as they've been set out, you won't be able to go ahead with what you're talking about, even though everyone would love to do it.
Well, look, we are confident, and this is why we announced the phasing in. We are confident that we can both meet the 28 billion a year in the second half of the Parliament and our fiscal rules, and Rachel's absolutely clear about this. The fiscal rules are non-negotiable. We're confident we can meet both. And also Rachel said something very important, which is good chancellors know when to say, and indeed shadow chancellors know when to say no and when to say yes. And, she has been incredibly sparing about, and rightly so, about the priorities that she has, but given that this is our growth mission, and it's such an important mission for our party and indeed for the country, it's absolutely fundamental.
I mean, do you think the way, I'm getting into quite nerdy territory, but I'm guessing the audience will go with it.
Yeah, sure.
It's a good audience for these questions. I mean, you were involved in spending reviews in the Treasury. Do you think the way spending reviews work now allows for the kind of conversations you're talking about? Or do you think a Labour government is actually going to need to rethink the way it does spending reviews and the way it sets these kinds of priorities as you're thinking about your first year in government should you win the election?
I mean, I think, we instituted, I was an advisor in the Treasury many moons ago under Gordon, and we instituted 3-year spending reviews. Up to that point, spending reviews had been annual, which was a kind of hopeless way of operating, really, because it gave no ability to plan. So I think, once you have a sort of spending review, multi-year spending reviews are important, not just in this area, but across the board. I think, though, there is a wider point to your question, which is, and maybe this is implicit, which is the role of the Treasury in meeting this agenda. And I don't think this is a sort of criticism in any way of Treasury civil servants, but I think, how the Treasury becomes a sort of ally of this agenda, which is obviously what it's obviously central to Rachel's mission, is a sort of really important question. And also, look, frankly, and again, this audience will know these questions very well, and you will from the Institute for Government. How you genuinely this is why I think the missions thing is a real insight. How you sort of break down the silos is sort of cliche, but how you break down the silos. The agenda I've talked about can't be delivered by my department. If I'm the Secretary of State on my own, it requires DLUP and the Treasury and the business department, and there's lots and lots of departments that are involved in this, and in a way there's a sort of family of departments that are relevant to the whole net zero transition. I mean, every department in a way, but a department like DEFRA, DFT, absolutely fundamental to this. So we are, as part of our sort of preparing for the eventuality of being in government, thinking about how do you, what is the way to deliver this? And I actually also take quite a lot of inspiration from, if you take 2030, from the vaccine task force model, because that was a way of bringing, of if you like, breaking down those silos. So we're thinking about those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to come on to the missions because I can see that they are a big part of Labour's thinking at the moment, but they are so antithetical to the way government works at the moment, which is part of the reason you want to sort of bring that way of thinking into government. But how do you, beyond spending reviews, how do you start to get a government which is built around individual departments, which does have quite a weak centre, which is very unused to sort of long-term thinking, let alone sort of 10, 15-year thinking? How do you get them to think in kind of way, in missions, in a missions-oriented way?
I'm sort of tempted to say that's Sue Gray's job, but I think it's something Sue and I have talked about actually. It is obviously sort of work in progress for us. But my sense from being a Secretary of State is, the civil service is incredibly responsive. I think this is a sort of why public debate is so, frankly, off the wall, because the civil service is incredibly responsive to the demands of a government, particularly a new government. And so I think there is an opportunity, and I think there's also an opportunity for people who've not been Secretaries of State before, a new government, to think, how are we going to do this differently? And, different people have proposed different things. There's a family of departments that are most relevant to this area. Are there ways of collaborating? There was an Office of Criminal Justice Reform where some of those, you probably know about this better than I do, where some of those departments work together. So there are models, I think, that we can draw on, not to sort of reshape government and throw it all in the air, but to find ways in which you can, the individual departments obviously continue to play their role, but there is much more of a coming together well beyond a sort of cabinet committee system, which is, as Maura Wallace, my former permanent secretary, always said to me, was a sign of failure, not of success.
Indeed. I'm going to come to the audience just in 1 minute. I wanted to ask one final question, which is going back to this idea about catalytic investment. US, as you say, put in huge amounts of money through IRA EU are in slightly slower fashion trying to figure out a large investment of their own. China has obviously put huge amounts of money into electric vehicles. Where is our area of competitive advantage, given our economy is sort of smaller than those three? Where can we fit into this picture?
I mean, I would identify, and there are a number of areas. I mean, first of all, offshore wind, partly because of what we did in the last Labour government, sort of setting this off early, partly because of, frankly, of the North Sea and our geographical advantages. The stalling of the recent offshore wind auction was really disappointing, but floating offshore wind is the next sort of frontier. We're still the second largest generator of offshore wind in the world after China. So there is huge opportunity in that. And then also to do with our seas, hydrogen, the hydrogen economy, carbon capture. I mean, carbon capture in particular has massive potential. We were at the so-called Acorn project in Scotland, Keir and I, last week, looking at just some of the possibilities there. So, I mean, there's other possibilities. I'll probably have offended people in the room. I mean, tidal is something that Britain is strong in. There's obviously nuclear, which is, SMRs offer potential. So I think there's a lot of areas, but I think they're the main areas that I would identify.
Great. I'm going to take one round of questions, 3 or 4 questions, and then I'm going to ask you to answer them all together, if that's okay. We've got a man in a purple jumper just here, if we've got mics around. Thank you. Just say who you are as well, that would be helpful.
My name's Gareth Jones. Thank you so much for outlining such a hopeful vision. It's very welcome. But a couple of things. Do you deny the recent report that the 28 billion is going to get watered down even further? That came out at the weekend from a senior Labour source, we're told. And bigger picture, with industrial policy like this, you throw a lot of money at things and there is inevitably waste. You might regard that as a price worth paying, but what if Labour instead regulated the hell out of the market, regulated its way to the same outcome by forcing private investment to happen rather than spending public money?
Okay, there were some questions at the back. A man just behind you there. Just with his hand up. Yep, still there. Yeah.
Thank you. Mark from the Centre for Inequality and Levelling Up. We're conducting a research right now looking at the role of businesses in tackling inequality. And what we've found is that businesses are not only keen to get involved in issues of inequality and fair growth as a partner with government, but actually as a leader. And that they have a lot of initiatives in this space. And actually they sometimes argue that government can act as a barrier to some of their initiatives in tackling inequality. So what would an upcoming Labour government do to support businesses wanting to tackle
Are you thinking of a particular example, Mark, when you say government acting? I mean, I can think of many ways in which government acts as a barrier, but are you thinking of particular examples?
Yeah, so the primary route that we identified in terms of how businesses want to tackle inequality is through skills and education, and they often said, for instance, that apprenticeship levy was a strong barrier because they could not use it and therefore provide skills opportunities for people that were looking for jobs or people that wanted to grow their skills.
I'm going to take one more, and then I'm going to allow Ed to answer. There's one just there, just behind, at the back row there. That row there.
Roland Storty from Minfo. A one-sentence question. How will you combat the impending misinformation that'll be targeting the green growth initiatives in the upcoming election period?
Maybe you're coming to give me advice on that. Is that right, Ron?
I'd love to.
Okay. Maybe that's my answer. You've probably got better answers than I have. Okay, so I think it was Gareth. Look, I couldn't be clearer that, and Keir Starmer's office were absolutely clear. We're absolutely committed to the 28 billion. Rachel set out the position in June. The position hasn't changed. It's going to ramp up to 28 billion a year in the second half of the Parliament. I'm old enough to have experience of these things. You don't believe everything you read in the newspapers or online or whatever. On your question about regulation, so regulation is an incredibly important tool in the box. But I think the question one has to confront is it enough on its own? And I think if it had been enough on its own, we would have done better. I mean, let me give you an example. We've had a 60% domestic content requirement in offshore wind licenses, but it hasn't really worked. I mean, it hasn't delivered the domestic content, at least not the right kind of domestic content, and the system has been in part gamed, and in part the companies felt it hasn't worked properly. I think, you know, we often talk about the burning platform that we face in relation to the climate crisis, but I think we also face a burning platform into these industrial policy opportunities and challenges. And obviously government doesn't get everything right, but look, I think that you can do this in a sensible way. And it's not going to be me as a Secretary of State making sort of arbitrary decisions about which companies to support. You know, we will find ways of doing this. And I think it's actually a very important lesson that I take. You know, when I talked about the Boris Johnson conversation, I don't think it should be, you know, the government minister wakes up one morning and thinks X, and then X happens. There needs to be a sort of proper process to make sure that any investments you make are value for money, and as you think about the energy mix, it's based on proper hard evidence. Mark, on your question about private business, I mean, I think it's a really important point, and I think if you think about business leadership and business enthusiasm for this agenda, business is so often ahead of government, actually, on these questions. And the skills and apprenticeship levy is a problem that Bridget Phillipson, our Shadow Education Secretary, has talked about, and we've got plans to get round or sort of deal with many of these problems. But I think your point about barriers is sort of broader than skills. I mean, it's about uncertainty. So if you don't know from one day to the next what the policy on onshore wind is going to be, or on net zero, I mean, this net zero thing that Sunak did has been so damaging, because it sent a message around the world to investors that Britain's going slow on the transition. Britain's giving up any leadership role. I mean, if you're an investor or you're the head of country in Britain trying to argue for investment, your board is going to say, as many businesses say this to me, your board is going to say, well, I'm really not sure about investing in Britain. We've heard all this stuff from Sunak. These signalling devices, the signalling is just terrible. So I think you need a sense of mission, a sense of certainty, and then government needs to undertake to break down these barriers: skills, supply chains, grid, planning, some of the things we've talked about. And I don't have a good answer to the question about disinformation, but happy to discuss.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to wrap up this session now. We don't have time for any more, and I'm sure we could go on for a lot longer. So please join me in saying a big thank you to Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Sam. Fantastic stuff. It's been a long day, but I think it's been pretty productive. I hope we've managed to answer some of those questions we posed at the beginning of the day. I took down copious notes, lots of required thinking for me to try and distill when I appear on Times Radio next time, and try and answer some of those questions in a way that people will understand, because we're trying to broadcast and we're trying to help people really understand the questions that face this country and provide honest answers. Look, some of the things, we've talked about the need for growth, what's been holding it back, austerity, Brexit. Look at how things can be done at a local level. Examples, Bradford, York, Liverpool, the studies and reviews that have been done time and again. We know what works, but we don't implement it. It's an implementation crisis. Industrial strategy, are we inching towards one? What will Labour's look like in government? So many things, consistency and continuity. People are appealing for that, especially the business community. Do we need to be less grandiose and more maybe like Denmark or Holland instead of trying to outcompete Germany and France? We've got a lot to do. Are we in a Potemkin fantasy world? I think you said that earlier, Sam. So much to discuss, but it's been really good. I think we've made a decent fist of it. So for those able to stay on a little longer, do join us for a drinks reception in rooms opposite, where lunch was served over there. And before leaving this room, I want to give a huge thanks to all the speakers who have generously shared their time and insights today, to all CPP staff who brought together such a memorable event, and to the Royal Society Events and AV team for facilitating the Inclusive Growth Conference 2023. Please take your belongings and tote bag with you, and do share your feedback with us on the event survey. The Power Test podcast will be recording in this lecture hall during the reception. So if you need or want to return to this room, please be very, very quiet. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the evening, and see you sometime, someplace very soon. Thank you very much.